Welcome back, everyone, to Rambling Dan Rose Deep Dive Book Reviews. We're glad to have you with us. Today, we're going to be taking a deep dive into a book that has been making some waves. It's called The Tech Coup, How to Save Democracy from Silicon Valley.
Okay.
And it's by Marietje Schaake.
Interesting.
And it really gets you thinking about how all this technology, all this power in Silicon Valley,
Mm-hmm.
it makes you wonder
Yeah.
if it's actually putting our democracies at risk.
I can see that.
I mean, just the other day I was reading an article about AI writing legislation.
Really?
Yeah, like algorithms shaping the laws we live by. Freaked me out a little bit, not gonna lie.
Yeah, I can see why that would be a little unsettling.
It is. So before we dive into the tech coup itself, can you tell us a bit about Marietje Schaake? Why is her perspective on this so valuable?
Well, Marietje Schaake, she's not just some, armchair theorist.
Right.
This is someone who's been in the trenches. She spent a decade as a member of the European Parliament, dealing with digital policy, cybersecurity, all that.
Wow, so she's seen it all firsthand.
Exactly. And then, get this, she actually moved to Silicon Valley, became a fellow at Stanford.
She went right to the heart of the beast.
You could say that. It seems like she wanted to get a closer look to try and bridge the gap between policymakers and the tech world.
Makes sense. You need to understand both sides to find solutions. Okay, so let's get into the tech coup. The book is structured around 8 chapters, each tackling a different angle of this whole tech and democracy thing.
Okay.
We'll try to hit them all, but let's start with chapter 1, the code.
Okay.
Now, I'm curious, what was the original dream of the internet, and how does that compare to what we're seeing today?
Well, Schaake takes us back to the early days. The visionaries, like Tim Berners-Lee,
Yeah,
they imagined this open, decentralized internet promoting universal access, collaboration. It was almost utopian.
right, like this digital utopia. But what happened? How did we end up with a handful of companies calling the shots?
Well, that's what Schake's trying to unravel. She argues that the very structure of the internet, the code itself, has been manipulated to concentrate power and wealth in the hands of a few.
So the code is almost like the DNA of the internet, and it's
Yeah.
been, let's say, reinterpreted.
You could say that. And she uses a really interesting example to illustrate this. Uber's Grayball app. Ever heard of that?
Gray ball. I vaguely remember something about it. Remind me what that was all about.
Well, Grayball was this custom software developed by Uber, and they weren't using it for, making rides smoother.
No. What were they doing?
They were using it to, get this, deceive regulators.
Wait, seriously? How?
Essentially, Grayball identified and blocked users who Uber suspected were law enforcement, trying to crack down on their operations.
So they were playing hide and seek with the very people supposed to be overseeing them. That's bold.
Bold is a good word for it. It really shows the attitude some tech companies have towards regulation. They see it as an obstacle, not a framework.
Yeah, like we make the rules, not you.
That's the vibe. And Schaake points out this irony. These companies rely on government contracts
Right.
while lobbying against regulation. Like Microsoft and Amazon, they have huge contracts with the U.S. Department of Defense.
So they want the government's money, but not its oversight. Interesting.
Right. And then there's the revolving door phenomenon. People move between government and the tech industry. It blurs the lines.
So it's cozy. A little too cozy, maybe. Makes you wonder who's really calling the shots.
That's the question.
Okay, so we've seen how the code itself can be used to concentrate power, but what about the physical infrastructure, the actual stuff that makes the internet work?
Right. That's where chapter 2 comes in, the stack.
The stack. Okay, so what's that all about?
Well, Schaake focuses on the often invisible physical infrastructure, the data centers, undersea cables, all those tangible things that power the digital world.
Yeah, it's easy to forget it's all running on something physical.
Right. Out of sight, out of mind. But Schaake argues that control over this infrastructure gives tech companies a whole other level of power.
I see. So where are these data centers? Who owns the cables? Does that matter?
It matters a lot, according to Schaake. She uses Meta as an example, specifically their attempts to build a massive data center in the Netherlands.
Okay, tell me more about that.
So Meta, back when they were still Facebook, they tried to build this enormous data center using shell companies to keep their involvement secret.
Sneaky.
Right. But when the news got out, it caused a huge backlash.
I can imagine. People probably felt like they were being kept in the dark.
Exactly. There were concerns about environmental impact, lack of transparency, potential for data privacy violations, and it really highlights the power of these companies. They can operate in the shadows, impacting entire communities without any real accountability.
It's a bit unsettling, to be honest. It's like we're handing over control of essential resources to entities that prioritize profit over everything else.
And it gets even more unsettling when you consider the vulnerability of this infrastructure. The internet runs on physical cables, servers, buildings, things that can be damaged, disrupted, or even attacked.
Oh, yeah. I remember that incident a few years back. A cable cut off the coast of Norway. There were whispers about Russian involvement, and it showed how fragile this whole system is.
That's exactly what Sheikh is talking about. That cable cut disrupted internet service for thousands of people, highlighting how reliant we are on this infrastructure we barely even think about.
Yeah, it's easy to take it for granted until it's gone.
Right. And she argues this vulnerability is only going to increase as this infrastructure becomes even more privatized. It's becoming harder to know who owns and controls these essential networks. And that lack of transparency creates real risks. Geopolitical conflicts, economic disruptions, all sorts of things.
Yeah, it makes you think. What if someone wanted to, I don't know, cripple a nation's economy or sow chaos? Taking out their internet infrastructure would be a pretty effective way to do it.
Exactly. And that leads us to the next chapter, which gets even darker, the weaponization of everything.
Okay, the weaponization of everything. Now that sounds ominous. What's Shay getting at there?
Well, in this chapter, she explores how technology can be used not just for, controlling information, but as an actual weapon to cause real-world harm.
Give me an example. What kind of weapon are we talking about?
Well, she talks about the 2021 Colonial Pipeline ransomware attack that shut down a major U.S. pipeline, causing panic and fuel shortages across the East Coast.
Oh, yeah, I remember that. I was stuck in those crazy gas lines. It felt like something out of a movie.
It did, didn't it?
Yeah.
And Sheikh uses this to show how vulnerable our critical infrastructure is to these kinds of cyber attacks. This wasn't just some online prank. This had real-world consequences.
Yeah, for sure. So remind me again who was behind that attack.
A group called DarkSide claimed responsibility. They demanded a ransom in Bitcoin to restore the pipeline. And what's really concerning is how this attack exposed not just our physical vulnerability, but also how hard it is to pinpoint responsibility in these attacks.
Right. Is it a criminal organization, a foreign government, or just some lone wolf hacker in their basement? It's hard to say for sure.
That's the point. And that makes it incredibly difficult to deter these attacks or hold anyone accountable. And that's what Sheikh highlights. Our current international law is just not equipped to deal with the accountability of individuals and organizations in these kinds of cyber conflicts.
Yeah, it feels like we're playing catch up, like the law is always a step behind the technology. It's scary.
And the Colonial Pipeline attack wasn't a one-off. We're seeing these kinds of cyber attacks happening more and more, targeting all sorts of things. Hospitals, power grids, financial institutions, government agencies, the list goes on.
So it's like a new kind of warfare, but the battlefield is digital. And the weapons are lines of code. It's a bit overwhelming, to be honest.
It is. But knowledge is power, as they say. And that's what Sheikh is trying to do. Empower us with knowledge.
Okay, so we've talked about the code, the stack, and now the weaponization of technology. But where do we go from here? What can we do about it?
Well, that's what we'll dive into next. We've got a lot more ground to cover, and Sheikh has some interesting ideas about how to push back against this tech coup.
Just briefly, we want to say thank you for listening to Rambling Dan Rowe's Deep Dive Book Reviews. Please remember to like and subscribe to support our channel. Thank you. Okay, so we're back, continuing our deep dive into the Tech Coup, this eye-opening book by Marietje Schaake.
Yeah, it really gets you thinking, doesn't it?
For sure. Does Schaake offer any solutions? I mean, it feels a bit overwhelming.
Well, she does. And in Chapter 4, The End of the Public Interest, she starts by talking about this concept called the precautionary principle.
Precautionary principle. Okay, break that down for me.
So it's basically about flipping the script on how we think about risk with new tech.
Okay.
Instead of waiting for something to go wrong, the precautionary principle says, hold on, let's evaluate potential risks before we unleash this thing on the world.
Makes sense. Especially with things like AI that are developing so fast.
We don't even fully understand how it works, but we're already integrating it into everything. It's like a massive experiment, and we're the guinea pigs.
Yeah, a bit unnerving, to say the least. So, what does Schaake suggest we do? Does she have specific technologies in mind?
She does. She points out 4 technologies she thinks democratic governments need to be really careful about.
Okay, which ones?
Commercial spyware, data brokerage, facial recognition tech, and cryptocurrencies.
Okay, let's unpack those one by one.
Mm-hmm.
Starting with commercial spyware, it sounds like something out of a James Bond film.
Right. But it's very real, unfortunately.
So what is it exactly?
It's software that can hack into phones, computers, you name it. It gives attackers access to all sorts of personal information, communications, photos, even real-time location tracking.
So it's basically digital espionage. Who's using this stuff?
Well, Schaake says both governments and private entities are using it.
Oh, wow.
And she points out it's often used by authoritarian regimes to target journalists, activists, anyone they see as a threat.
That's disturbing. So they can silence dissent, control the narrative, all through this spyware.
Yeah, it's a powerful tool for repression.
And it's readily available. Like, anyone can buy this.
That's the scary part. It raises a lot of questions about ethics, about who's responsible for developing and selling these tools.
Big questions. Okay, what about this data brokerage thing? Most people probably don't even know what that is.
Yeah, it's a shadowy industry.
Fill me in.
Data brokers collect and sell tons of personal data, often without our knowledge or consent.
How did you get it?
They scrape it from public records, social media, online activity, loyalty programs, anything they can get their hands on.
So they build these detailed profiles of us without us even realizing it.
Exactly. And then they sell those profiles to whoever wants them, marketers, advertisers, you name it.
And then those buyers can use that information to manipulate us, target us with ads, even discriminate against us.
That's the danger. Schaake argues this unchecked data collection is a huge threat to our privacy, our autonomy, even our democracy itself. I mean, if someone has enough data about you, they can predict your behavior, influence your decisions.
Yeah, it's a bit creepy. It's like they know us better than we know ourselves.
Right. And it's hard to protect ourselves when we don't even know it's happening.
Makes you want to go off the grid completely. Okay, what about facial recognition? I know that's a controversial one.
It is. It's being used more and more for surveillance, law enforcement, even in some stores.
Ah.
But there are big concerns about accuracy, especially when it comes to identifying people of color. And that can lead to wrongful arrests, discrimination.
I've heard about that. The algorithms are biased, right?
Exactly. Schaake points out those biases, and she criticizes companies like Clearview AI.
What do?
They've scraped billions of images from the internet without consent to create these huge facial recognition databases.
Wait, so they're just using our photos without asking?
Yeah, pretty much. It raises big questions about privacy, about who owns our digital identities.
Right, it's like Big Brother. But instead of a government watching us, it's these private companies.
That's the unsettling part. Okay, last one on the list. Cryptocurrencies. How do they threaten democracy?
Yeah, that one seems a bit different from the others.
Right. Well, Schaake argues that cryptocurrencies, while they're often touted as promoting freedom and decentralization, actually pose risks to democratic governance.
Interesting. I mean,
Yeah.
I can see how the anonymity and lack of regulation could be problematic.
Exactly. She points out that cryptocurrencies can be used for money laundering, ransomware attacks, even financing terrorism.
Yikes, that's serious stuff.
And then there's the volatility. The value can fluctuate wildly, making them risky for investors and a headache for regulators.
Yeah, and those fluctuations can be exploited for market manipulation, other shady stuff.
Right. And let's not forget the environmental impact of all that crypto mining.
It's not as green as some people make it out to be, right?
Definitely not. Schaake uses the example of the FTX collapse, which wiped out billions, to illustrate the risks.
Yeah, that was a mess. So it's not all sunshine and rainbows in the crypto world.
Definitely not. She argues we need to be way more cautious about embracing cryptocurrencies without addressing these concerns first.
Okay, fair enough.
Mm-hmm.
So those are the 4 technologies Schaake flags as potentially problematic. But are there any solutions? I mean, what can we actually do to push back against this tech coup?
Well, that's what she gets into in the next few chapters. And she starts by tackling this idea of companies being on the front lines of global conflicts in Chapter 5, Tech on the Front Lines.
Okay, tech on the front lines. That sounds intriguing, what you talk about there.
So Schaake is arguing that the nature of conflict is changing. It's not just about countries fighting each other anymore. Tech companies are increasingly finding themselves right in the middle of things.
Really? I mean, I can see how they play a role in information warfare, propaganda, and all that. But on the actual front lines.
Yeah, think about the war in Ukraine. Companies like SpaceX, with their Starlink satellites, they've been providing internet access. Microsoft's been helping with cyber defense. And then you have companies like Clearview AI, whose facial recognition tech is being used to identify casualties.
Wow, so it's not just shaping public opinion or controlling the narrative. It's actively influencing the outcomes of these conflicts.
Exactly. And Schaake argues this raises all sorts of questions about accountability, transparency, even state sovereignty. Like, if private companies are making decisions that impact war, who's ultimately responsible?
Yeah, it blurs the lines between public and private in a big way. It's a bit unsettling.
Right. And this takes us to a key question Schaake explores in Chapter 6, the framers. How have tech companies managed to shape the public debate about their own power? How have they framed the narrative?
You know, it's interesting. It does feel like tech companies have been really good at controlling the story, making themselves out to be the good guys, the innovators.
Exactly. And anyone who questions them is labeled anti-progress, a Luddite, you know the drill.
Yeah, for sure. But how do they do it? How have they been so successful at manipulating the narrative?
Schaake argues they've mastered the art of framing. They present themselves as the drivers of progress, while painting governments as bureaucratic, slow, incompetent.
Yeah, that classic move fast and break things.
Yeah.
Silicon Valley mentality.
Right. But what are they breaking? Often it's democratic norms and institutions.
Right. And then they say, don't worry, we'll self-regulate. But that hasn't worked out so well, has it?
Not really. Schaake points to all these pledges and initiatives that haven't really amounted to much. A lot of talk, not a lot of action.
So it's a way to appear to be addressing concerns without actually making any real changes.
Pretty much. And this framing has been incredibly effective in delaying regulation and allowing these companies to keep accumulating power. It's like they've created this reality distortion field around themselves.
I like that analogy. And this brings us to Chapter 7, reclaiming sovereignty. Okay, so if we're being manipulated, how do we break free? How do we reclaim our sovereignty in this digital age?
That's the big question, and Schaake doesn't shy away from it. She argues that we're at this critical point facing a global power shift that's challenging traditional ideas of state sovereignty.
So it's not just about regulating these companies, it's about fundamentally rethinking how power works in this digital age.
Exactly. And she contrasts the approaches of the European Union and the United States, showing how the EU has been more proactive in regulating tech.
Right, the EU has implemented some pretty significant regulations, like the GDPR, which gives individuals more control over their data. How does that compare to the U.S. approach?
Well, the EU seems to be focusing on protecting citizens' rights, making sure tech companies operate within clear rules. They're trying to establish what they call digital sovereignty, asserting their authority over technology even when it's developed outside their borders.
Okay, so they're not just letting these companies dictate the rules of the game. They're stepping in and saying, no, this is how it's going to be. What about the U.S.?
The U.S., on the other hand, has been more focused on national security, sometimes at the expense of domestic concerns.
So it's less about protecting citizens' rights and more about maintaining a competitive edge.
You could say that. And this tension between these two approaches is playing out in how they try to regulate tech giants. Schaake talks about the Restrict Act in the U.S.
What's that?
It's a bill that aims to restrict digital products from foreign adversaries, but critics say it's too broad, that it could be used to infringe on civil liberties.
It's like trying to find that balance between protecting national security and safeguarding individual rights.
And that brings us to the final chapter, Chapter 8, prioritizing the public. If we want to counter this tech coup, how do we put the public interest back at the center of things?
Yeah, we've talked about the problems, but what are the solutions? How do we make sure technology serves humanity, not just the interests of a few powerful companies?
Schaake argues that transparency is key. We need to know how these companies operate, how they're making decisions.
Yeah, it's like they operate in a black box. We have no idea what's going on inside.
Right. So she calls for more transparency in algorithms, AI development, content moderation, investments, government procurement, all of it.
So shining a light on the whole process. But how do we actually do that? These companies are notoriously secretive.
It won't be easy, but she suggests things like strengthening freedom of information laws, requiring companies to disclose more about their data practices, and having independent oversight to monitor how technology is being used.
So it's about creating checks and balances, making sure power isn't concentrated in the hands of a few. But it's not just about government regulation, is it? Individuals have a role to play too, right?
Absolutely. Schaake talks about digital citizenship, encouraging individuals to be more informed, more engaged.
Okay, I like that.
Yeah.
So what does that look like in practice? What can we as individuals do to push back against this tech coup?
Well, I think it starts with education. We need to understand how technology works, how it's being used, how it's impacting our lives. We can't just blindly accept what we're told.
So being more critical, more aware. But what about concrete actions? Are there specific things we can do?
Definitely. We can support organizations fighting for digital rights and privacy. We can contact our elected officials and demand they prioritize these issues. We can choose to support companies that align with our values and boycott those that don't.
So it's about using our voices, our votes, our wallets to create change.
Exactly. And it's about reclaiming our agency. We're not just passive users of technology, we're citizens, and we have a say in how it's shaped.
I like that. Okay, so we've talked about the challenges, the potential solutions, and the role of individual action. But there's one more thing Schaake emphasizes that I want to touch on. International cooperation. Why is that so important?
She argues that no single nation can effectively address these challenges on its own. These tech companies operate globally. They're too powerful, too interconnected. It's like trying to contain a wildfire with a garden hose.
So we need a coordinated global response. But is that even realistic? I mean, the world is pretty divided right now.
It's definitely a challenge. But Schaake says the stakes are too high to ignore. The erosion of democracy, disinformation, the weaponization of technology, these are global threats. They require global solutions.
So she's calling for countries to put aside their differences and work together on this. It's a big ask.
It is, but she sees it as essential if we want to protect democratic values in the digital age.
I see. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground, from the dark side of technology to potential solutions and the need for global action. Before we wrap things up, I'm curious, what was your overall impression of the Tech Coup?
You know, it's a dense book, a lot to take in, but it's also incredibly thought-provoking. Schaake doesn't shy away from the tough questions, and she challenges us to think critically about our relationship with technology.
Yeah, she definitely doesn't sugarcoat things.
No, she doesn't, but she also offers hope. She doesn't just present the problems, she provides a roadmap for a better future.
And that's what makes it so compelling, right? It's not just a doom and gloom critique, it's a call to action.
Exactly. She reminds us that we have a choice in how we shape the future of technology. We can be passive consumers, or we can be active citizens, demanding that technology serves humanity, not the other way around.
Powerful stuff. Okay, well, I think we've got a pretty good job unpacking the Tech Coup. It's been a fascinating conversation, and I feel like I've learned a lot.
Me too, and I hope our listeners have as well.
So what's the takeaway? What do we want people to do after listening to this deep dive?
Well, I think the key takeaway is that we can't just sit back and let technology shape our world without our active participation. We need to be informed, we need to be engaged, and we need to be willing to speak up and demand that technology serves the public good.
I couldn't agree more. So to our listeners, if you're interested in learning more, definitely check out the Tech Coup. It's a must-read for anyone who cares about the future of democracy in the digital age.
Absolutely. It's a book that will stay with you long after you've finished reading it.
Well, that's it for our deep dive into the Tech Coup. Thanks for joining us on this journey. We hope you found it informative and inspiring.
And remember, the future of technology is not predetermined. We have the power to shape it. Let's make sure we use that power wisely.
Thanks for listening.